I'm going to put Karen on spotlight and say, please welcome Karen Glass for a kindness story.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad everyone could come. When I was mining my storytelling collection for stories on kindness, I was looking at fairy tales and I found so many where the there's a giver and a receiver of kindness, and the giver of kindness is often rewarded with some gift, three wishes, or a pot of food that never is empty, or in the case of the princess, she kisses a frog and has a prince given to her. But I wanted something a little more concrete. So I just had my eye out for stories. And I came across the story of Mike, the grocery bagger. So Mike was a young man actually with Down syndrome, and he worked in a grocery store. And an act of kindness right there is there are many grocery stores that hire people who have lesser abilities or who have challenges, and they give them the job that they are able to do. So Mike was a bagger of groceries, and he moved the carts around the parking lot. Now, he did his job well, but after he was there a little while, one day the store manager noticed that there was a long line in aisle one where Mike was the bagger. And like a good store manager, he opened the next aisle and invited people to step in the next aisle. And some did because they wanted to save time, but some did not. And he wondered about that. And he watched the cashier and he watched Mike, and he didn't see what the problem was. The next time Mike worked, it happened again. And there was a long line, different cashier, but there behind Mike's cashier aisle was a long line of people. So again, the store manager interfered and opened up a new cash register and invited people to move to the faster lane. When the third person refused to move, he asked them, "Why is it you want to stay in this line?" And the gentleman answered, he said, "Because whenever I'm in the line with Mike, when he's bagging groceries, he puts something special in my bag." Oh, the store manager was a little wary of this, and so he watched, but didn't see anything. After Mike's shift, he stopped and he said, "Mike, the customers tell me you put something in their bags. What is going on?" And Mike said, "Well, you had a meeting with all the staff and you told us to be welcoming to our customers. So every night I go home and I sit down with my father and we find something meaningful that might cheer somebody's life. And I write those down on cards. And when I bag groceries, I slip one of those cards in the bag." And then the manager looked, and sure enough, there in front of Mike was a stack of cards saying things like, "Kindness costs nothing, but means everything." Or, "You are the sunshine, bring to my day, you are the sunshine in today's world." Or, "Kindness is free, sprinkle it everywhere." And then the store manager understood. I thought, imagine kindness in a grocery store. I'm busy shopping. I haven't really been paying attention. So the next time I went grocery shopping, I looked and I saw kindness everywhere. I saw kindness. I saw a little baby, a cranky baby with a very busy mother, and I saw a grandmotherly type stop, play peekaboo with the baby until the baby laughed. And then I saw another time a very tall man help a very short woman reach something from the shelf. And I saw a store clerk help an elderly woman who wanted a box of Jell-O. And instead of telling her which aisle it was in, he went and he got it for her and brought it back to her. Kindness was everywhere. Now, kindness happened to me also as well one time in a grocery store. And I'm not sure if I was the giver or the receiver, but I was part of the whole thing. And what happened is I was in the cracker aisle of the grocery store, and I was coming down and a woman was coming towards me who I knew casually from church. And I stopped and I said, "So I haven't seen you a while. How are you?" where have you been? And she stopped, and together we stepped into this space. She said, I was at a funeral of my relative in Kentucky. And suddenly that opened the door. We talked about funeral, we talked about death, we talked about kindness and forgiveness. We talked about God and what happens afterwards. What a strange conversation in the middle of a cracker aisle. I have no recollection of how long we were there or what went on around us or even when that conversation was. I can't remember. I was trying to think of it for this story about how long ago that was. I don't know. It was a different time. It was a time out of time. And I see her now, we're in COVID, and I see her on Zoom Faces, and I see her sometimes in the street or passing in the car. And there is a spark, a connection that travels between us. It's we understand each other at a different level. And that's what kindness does. It is magic. There is magic in kindness, whether it's in folk tales or not. But this magic is like almost a spark of the divine right there in the cracker aisle. So really, kindness is everywhere, even in the cracker aisle of the grocery store.
Thank you, Karen.
The story I'm going to share today is called The Platinum Rule. Now, I had never heard of the Platinum Rule or even thought about it until a few years ago when I was teaching storytelling up at the John C. Campbell Folk School in Brasstown, North Carolina. I was just saying that I'd never heard of the Platinum Rule until I taught, never thought about it until I taught storytelling up at the John C. Campbell Folk School in Brasstown, North Carolina. And I announced one evening that the following morning we would have a story sharing time for everyone at the folk school that wanted to join. And so quite a few people showed up, several people I had never seen that weren't in my classes or anything. And one man indicated that he would like to share a story. And so he said, he said, there was this couple that lived up here in the mountains close by. And everybody said they were the kindest people they had ever seen. They had been married 60 or 70 years, but they always were kind and loving to each other and to everybody else. People even talked about it because they were so special. And then one day, the wife got seriously ill and had to take to her bed. And she was in bed, and that husband sat by her bed night and day and tried to do everything he could think of to make her comfortable and as happy as she could be. The doctor came in and said that it would not be long before she would leave this earth. And sure enough, in a few days, one morning, her breath was very labored, and the husband began to get very concerned. And just as she was about to take her last breath, she sat up in bed and she looked over at him and she said, I've just got one thing I want to say to you. You know how you would always give me the end piece of the loaf of bread? Well, I just wanted you to know that I hated that. And with that, she fell back into her bed and was about to pass into another world. And the husband he couldn't believe it, but he managed to get out at the last minute. But I gave it to you because I loved it best. Now, the old man that was telling the story that morning said, now I know that the good book says that we're supposed to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. But it makes more sense to me if we do unto others as they would like to be done unto. And I've never forgot that old man or forgotten his story. And I can see that somehow there is a rule that's greater than the golden rule. And I call it the platinum rule. And that's do unto others as they would like to be done unto. Or maybe it's just the way we all should live. Thank you.
Take a breath and welcome in this story. and make room for the next. Please welcome Elisa Pearmain to share a story.
Hello, everyone. This is so wonderful to have so many of you here on this Sunday afternoon. And I feel very honored to have been invited to take part in a concert having to do with such an important theme. To me, I had a father who was extremely generous and kind, and on his gravestone, we put the Dalai Lama quote, "My religion is kindness." And I've just been thinking about that and thinking about all the blessings of kindness as I decided which stories to tell. And I'd like to begin with a quote, and that is that everyone you meet is fighting a great battle that you know nothing about. So be kind, always be kind. And I know the Dalai Lama said something very similar. This one I found from Brad Meltzer. And the story I'm going to tell, I read in a book called Love for No Reason by Marcy Shimoff. She'd been looking at the Italian countryside roll by through the train window for some time, seeing the little farms and the vineyards and the towns go by. Her name was Susie Penzas, and the year was 1942. She was riding alone, hoping to avoid the authorities. You see, she had been born and raised in Germany and had had to flee some 3 years earlier. And since then, she had been moving from friend's house to friends of a friend's house, always trying to avoid the authorities. And here she was again, riding to a new town and a new safe house. Suddenly, she heard a noise at the back of the car and the doors came open. And her heart began to pound as she saw that it was two of the fascisti, the police in their black uniforms, the government police. And it pounded even harder when she saw they were stopping at each row and demanding the papers of all the passengers. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, for she had no papers. And she knew that as soon as they discovered it, she would be arrested, she would be taken to a concentration camp, and it would be almost certain death, like so many others. Well, the tears began to fall faster and faster, and she began to sob and to try to hide her face and her sobbing, but they came closer and closer. When the man who was seated next to her put his book down and looked at her, and very politely he said, "Tell me, young woman, why are you crying?" She said, "Because I am Jewish and I don't have any papers." And she began to sob into her hands. But no sooner had she been sobbing again when this man, he seemed to stand up from his chair and he began to shout. And he said, "You stupido, how could you forget your papers again?
My God, I
Do I have to tell you?"
just read this story.
And the two policemen came right up to them and they said, "What's wrong? What's the commotion?" And the man said, "My wife, my stupido imbecile of a wife, she forgot her papers again. I have mine, but I don't know how many times I tell her. She's the most forgetful person in the world. I sent her to the store to get sausage. She comes home with chicken. If her head were not attached, it would..."
This story.
"Please, I am so tired of her. Take her away. Spare me further embarrassment." Susie looked up, but she saw the two policemen were laughing, and they said, "Sorry, sir, we don't involve ourselves in marital disputes." And they looked at his papers, gave them back, and moved on. When she could calm herself, she thanked the man. And a few stops later, she got off the train in a new town. She never learned his name or why he had acted so kindly, but we do know that she lived because she told this story to her great niece, Shifra, who told it to Marcia Shimoff, who wrote it down.
Where did I see that story? I think one of the Jewish stories. Was it one of the Jewish stories?
Somebody needs to go on mute. We can hear you. So if everyone would just check and make sure that you're on mute. Thank you.
I think somebody's getting into a Zoom, like someone's coming in, overriding the group.
I believe it was somebody who was commenting on this story. So I think it was.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Okay, I didn't want you to be hacked. That's all.
No, we everybody is here. So let me just mute everybody, and then I'm going to unmute myself. So there we are. Hopefully that should ease the problem. So thank you, Karen, Diane, and Elisa. You've set us off well. I'd like to tell you a story called The Most Marvelous Gift. It's a story about a little boy who happened to be a prince. But in every way, he was just like every little boy that you or I might know, except that he lived in a castle and his mother was the queen and his father was the king. And he had everything a little boy could ever wish for or ask for or want. He simply had to think it and speak it, and it was provided. So in that way, he might have been a little different. Of all the things that filled his room and filled the castle, there was really only one thing that he cared about. It was a small round orb that fit just so beautifully in his pocket. And when he pulled it out and stared into its inky blackness, he could see little stars sparkling in it. And if he held it up to his ear and shook it ever so gently, it was as if he could hear the pealing of bells that to him sounded almost like angels singing. And whenever he held this ball, no matter what else was going on in his life, he felt strong and kind and just good. So you would think that this little boy, this little prince, would be happy, but in fact, he wasn't, because his mother, the queen, was ill. In fact, she was so ill, he wasn't even allowed in her bedroom, and he would spend hours standing at her doorway, peeking in, just listening for her breathe. And all the while, he would hold this ball in his hand and stare into the stars sparkling in the inky blackness. And when he got really, really anxious, he'd gently shake it near his ear, and that gentle tolling of bells that sounded like angels singing would just help him breathe again. As summer turned into fall, the queen started to get better. And by November, she was well enough that he was welcomed into her room and could actually sit on her bed and hold her hand. And in early December, the announcement came from the king that at solstice night, there would be a grand party that all the people in the village would be welcome to come and celebrate the queen's new health. And with that, the prince said to his mother, I know everyone's going to bring you a gift, but I want to make sure that I give you the most marvelous gift. So Mama, please tell me, what would you like? Oh, sweet boy, she said, you know, all I want are your hugs and kisses. It just feels so lovely to hold your hand and be close to you again. Oh, Mama, I can give you that every day. I want to give you the most marvelous gift, something that nobody else can give you. What would that be, Mama? She took another breath and closed her eyes and got a faraway look in her face. And then ever so quietly, she said, when I was a little girl, my mama used to keep a little sprig of rosemary in the window, and it stayed there all winter long. And she would cut little sprigs to put into the cooking, and it would remind us of family and holidays. It would mean so much just to have a simple sprig of rosemary in my window. I think it would just help me feel better. Then you shall have it. I'll be the one to get it for you. And with that, he leaped off the bed and went out back to his room and called in all the royal servants. And he said, go out to the greenhouses and find me a potted sprig of rosemary. I must have it. And so they went. And it wasn't long before they came back one by one and said, sire, in the greenhouses, we have orchids and lilies and the most amazing flowers from all over the world, but we don't have anything as simple as rosemary. I'm so sorry. Well, then you must go out and do not come back until you have found it somewhere. I know it must be out there somewhere. And so several days passed, and one by one, forsaken servants returned and said, I'm sorry, sire, we could not find it. And with each returning servant, his heart began to sink, until at long last, one more servant came and said, sire, I have found what you seek. Where is it? Give it to me now. Well, it belongs to a woman at the far end of the village, and she says it's not for sale. Not for sale? What did you offer her? I offered her silver and gold for her rosemary, sir, but she says, no, she will not part with it. And with that, he called for his royal cape of white ermine and to saddle up the carriage with the 6 horses. And with his servants and entourage, he went out into the evening, into the far edge of the village, until he came to a very simple cottage. And there he went and knocked on the door. A very old woman greeted him with a low bow. Your Highness, welcome. Please come in. I understand you have some rosemary here, and I've come to buy it. Any price you say, I must have it. I must have your rosemary. Oh, sire, I am sorry. It is quite precious to me. It is the one of the few green things that I have all winter to put into my cooking, and it came down to me from my mother. I simply couldn't part with it. It gives me also, I believe, some medicinal qualities for my grandson. And with that, she looked off into the corner, and there the young prince saw that there was another boy lying on a pallet on the floor. He walked into the darker side and kneeled down close so he could see him, and he saw that this child was not well. And something inside him led him to reach into his pocket and pull out his orb. And after looking at it, he held it up for the sickly child to see, and then leaned down, put it next to his ear, and shook it ever so gently. And he could see by the look on the child's face that he too could hear the bells ring, and that in his own eyes he knew that he too could hear the angels singing. And the 2 boys smiled at each other. The prince took the ball back then and put it in his pocket and turned to the old woman and said, please, please, might I buy your rosemary? And she said, sire, I have another plan for you. Perhaps we might barter. Would you trade me for my rosemary your simple ball? My simple ball! This is the most precious thing to him in the world. He couldn't imagine not having it there in his pocket to remind him of his strength and his kindness and who he was in the world. And without saying a word, he simply turned and walked out of the cottage, slammed the door behind him, got in the carriage and said, take me back to the palace. And they rode back through that snowy night. And he entered the palace, back to his room, throwing off his ermine cloak, and said, bring me my servants, bring me the royal jeweler. And as the jeweler entered his room, he said, I need for you to make me the most magnificent necklace you have ever created. Spare no expense. Let there be sapphires and rubies and diamonds, because I want my mother to know that I have given her the most marvelous gift. Of course, sire, as you wish, it shall be done. And 4 days later, the jeweler appeared again and opened the box and showed the prince this most amazing piece of jewelry. And the prince took it into his hands and sighed and said, "It is indeed beautiful." And he waited for the night to come. 2 evenings later, it was solstice night, the shortest night of the year. And before it even reached 4 o'clock, the stars were sparkling in the sky. And he began to dress in his royal clothes and think about his mother and how beautiful she would look in this necklace. And as he paused, he wondered why he wasn't happy. In fact, why he felt so sad. And with that, he took off his fancy clothes, put on the simplest clothes he had, put the ball in his pocket and held on to it so dearly, and just began to walk the streets in a way that no one might know or recognize him. And as he wandered the streets aimlessly, passing all the people with great excitement, dressed, headed to the castle, he just looked up at that sky and that night and was in the end not surprised that he found himself at the door of the cottage at the end of the village. Gently he knocked. The door opened, and there stood the woman, smiling. "Welcome," she said. "Come in." And he did, and there they stood, looking into each other's eyes. She turned and gently walked into the kitchen area and came back with this simple sprig of rosemary and extended it. The young prince pulled the ball out, looked into its deep orb, and before he changed his mind, he dropped it into her hands. The two of them embraced without a word, and he turned back into the night, sheltering the rosemary under his robe that it might be warm in that snowy eve. He followed the lights and the music all the way back to the castle, made his way through the crowds until he entered the great hall. And there he saw his mother and his father up on their thrones at the very end. And he gently, slowly walked his way through the crowds until his mother's eye caught his, and he could see the smile burst on her face when she recognized him. He ran up the steps and she said, "Mother, I have brought you the most marvelous gift." She said, "My hugs and kisses?" "No, Mama, no. I've brought you." And there he held it in front of her and gently placed it in her hands, and saw the tears well up in her eyes as she leaned down and smelled that, and the years just dropped off her face as it took her back to her own childhood. "I love you so much," she said, and there came those hugs and kisses between him. And then he knew that she belonged to everyone tonight. And so he walked back down those steps, back through the crowd, back out through the open door into the night. And instinctively he reached into his pocket to take out his ball, but it was gone, and his heart sank. With tears in his eyes, he looked up, and there in that inky darkness, the snow had settled, and he could just make out the sparkling of stars in the distance. And in the far end of the village, the church bell tolled, and the sound of bells filled the night. And he became very quiet, because he could swear amidst those bells, he could hear the sound of angels singing. And in that moment, he felt so strong and kind and good. Taking a breath, breathe in a story, and make room for another. I'd like to welcome back Karen, who's going to take us on one more round. Want to come off mute, Karen?
That's wonderful, Lani. I have a story about a king also, and a prince. So once upon a time, there was a king, a good king. He loved his people, and he took care of them, and he had compassion for them. He wanted to make sure that his people were fed and that people had housing and that he would listen to the concerns of the people. He was kind, but he was also getting older. And he wanted to know that there would be a successor for him that would carry on his reign of kindness. There was a prince. He had a prince, a son who was very good also, but he wasn't sure that he was ready to be his successor. So he's decided to offer him a challenge. And he called the prince into his kingdom, into his office, and said to him, I would like you to find the secret of the spirit of Christmas for me. The prince was a good son, and he said yes to his father. And then he left the room, the office, and he was walking away. And how do I find the secret to the spirit of Christmas? Where do I even look? He went into the castle's library and searched through all the books and could find nothing. And he went to the file room downstairs and searched through the files. Somebody must have recorded somewhere that there would be a spirit of Christmas and what it meant. But he couldn't find it. And then he remembered that his father had a friend in the village, an older man, a counselor of sorts, and he decided to call on him. And he went into the village and he found the counselor, and the counselor said, yes, I don't know the secret to the spirit of Christmas, but I do know where you can find it. So he told the young prince that he should go to the village where the river meets the sea. It's about a 3-day journey. And there is a sage who sits by the river, and he knows the secret to the spirit of Christmas. So the prince said, I can do that. I can find him. I'll go ask him. But the counselor said, wait. He said, it will require some gifts that you need to bring to him. You need to bring a coat, a warm coat. You need to bring a bag of food, and you need to bring a sack of gold. So the prince thanked the counselor and left and went back to the village and collected the things he needed, the coat, the bag of food, and the sack of gold, and he put it in a pack that he could carry. And then he tried to put other things that he would need on this 3-day journey, but nothing fit. All he could do was carry the pack, and it was pretty heavy at that. And when he was ready, he set out. He traveled slowly because the pack was heavy and it was a long journey, and he tried to pace himself so that he would have enough energy for the whole trip. Somewhere towards evening of the first day, his feet were sore, he was getting tired, and he was by a woods. And he looked through the woods and he saw a fire in the woods. And he thought, someone's camping there. I'll go see if I can warm myself by his fire. And he went off the path and into the woods, and there he found a man stirring a pot of stew. And he said, sir, may I join you at your fire? May I share your fire? And the man said, sure, you're welcome, he said, and please share my dinner as well. So the two men, the prince and the man, sat and they ate stew, they were warmed by the fire, and they talked for a long time. When it was time to turn in, the prince wrapped himself in his warm cloak and began to find a soft spot to lay. But he noticed that the man didn't have anything warm to wrap himself in. And he said, do you not have a coat to wrap yourself in? The night is cool. And the man said, he said, I'm a little down on my luck, he said, and I sold my coat today to buy the food that we had for dinner. And the prince thought a moment and he said, I have just the thing. And he reached into his pack and he took out the coat and he gave it to the man. And the man was so grateful. He wrapped in it, was warm, and he fell asleep with a smile on his face. And as the prince lay down, he thought, surely the sage who waits in the town where the river meets the sea, surely that sage will be happy with the food and the gold and will not just miss the coat. So he too fell asleep. The next morning, the prince woke and was on his journey, on his way again, and his pack was lighter and his feet moved quicker. He walked for a while till about mid-afternoon. He came to a place, a crossroads, and there he saw a woman selling wreaths. And she said, please, sir, would you buy a wreath from me? I need the money to feed my children. And there were 3 small children by her feet. He said, I don't need a wreath, he said, but I think I might have something that you could use. And he reached into his pack and he took out the bag of food and he gave it to the woman. Tears came to her eyes and her children's faces lit up with smiles when they realized what their mother held. She said, thank you, sir, thank you. And he left. He put his pack on again and went down the road. His pack was much lighter now. And he traveled even faster. But he began to worry about what the sage would need. But he said, surely a bag of gold will buy the sage whatever he needs, coat, food, and still have enough for him. So I traveled on. Coming towards him, as he neared the town, coming towards him was a man pulling a heavy cart of vegetables, pulling it himself. And the prince stopped and he looked and he said to the man, what are you doing? He said, why are you pulling that cart of vegetables? And the man said, well, I have to get these vegetables to market. My donkey died last week. And if I don't get to these vegetables to market, and for some other markets as well, he said, I need to take them myself so that I can get the money to buy another donkey. And then he started to move on. And the prince turned as well. But the prince turned back and he said, I have something you could use. And he reached into his pack and he took out the bag of gold and he gave it to the man. He said, please, buy a donkey, buy a young one. He said that it should last you a long time. And then he went on his way. His pack was empty. And as he traveled, he thought that perhaps he could convince the sage that he was enough, that he came just looking for the answer to his question. So he traveled and he crested the top of the hill, and there beneath him was the village where the river meets the sea. And as he went down to the river, he expected to see a sage sitting by the river, but there was only a beggar. So he walked up to the beggar and he said, excuse me, sir, I was hoping to find a sage here who knew the answer to the secret of the spirit of Christmas. The sage said, the beggar said, well, I know the secret to the spirit of Christmas. I can tell you that. He said, but you needed to bring me gifts. I asked for a coat and a bag of food and a sack of gold. And the prince had bowed, said, I have none of those. He said, I had the coat, he said, but there was this man who was very cold. And the first night I gave him the coat. And then I met a woman whose children were hungry and I gave her the food. And just this afternoon, I met a man who was pulling a cart of vegetables himself to the market to sell because his donkey had died. I gave him the gold to buy another donkey. He said, but could you please tell me the secret of Christmas? He said, in your heart, can you find the kindness to do that? And the old beggar stood up and he took off his jacket, his worn and tattered jacket, and he took off his hat that was dirty and crusty. And the prince looked, it was his father. And his father said, my son, you have found the spirit of Christmas. You have found the secret to the spirit of Christmas. It is in your heart. And the young prince said, what is the secret of the spirit of Christmas? And the father said, well, it is kindness and caring for others. And indeed, the prince and the father, the king, walked back, and the king knew and was satisfied that the young man would know how to take care of the people in his kingdom. The end.
Thank you. Diane Rooks, I'm bringing you back to Spotlight.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a beautiful, beautiful story and a good reminder to all of us. I'd like to tell you a story about a trip that we made 5 years ago. Some good friends of ours invited us to go on a 3-week trip to India and Nepal that included a 9-day hike or trek to Annapurna Base Camp. And we said, we can't do that. We're too old. We can't do that. And they said, well, don't say no yet. Just think about it. Just think about it a while. And so we began to think about it. And I called a cousin of mine who has hiked in Nepal several times, went to Everest and Mount Mira. And he said, of course you can do it. He said, you have a Sherpa or a porter, as they're called where we were, and they carry everything for you. They fix all your food. They sterilize your water. They do everything. All you have to do is walk. We thought, well, maybe we could do it. And so we began to train. And about that time, the earthquake of 2015 that hit Nepal occurred. And we thought, well, now we definitely are not going. But then on investigation, we found out that the area where we would be was not damaged. And we were encouraged to come anyway because the people of Nepal needed the money that we would add to their economy. And so we were way back and forth. Finally decided to go. We started working out. We'd go into the North Georgia mountains every weekend and hike as much and far and fast as we could. And finally the day came and we thought we were ready, but we weren't. We flew to Delhi, then to Kathmandu. We met up with our group. They gave us our down sleeping bags, our down jackets, everything that we would need, a great big pack, all of our stuff. And we got on a bus and started out to where we would begin our trek. And our porters got on board. They were riding on top of the truck. So we started out the first day. They carried everything. Hari was the one that was assigned to me and my husband. He was such a gentle, kind soul and so helpful in everything we did. We trekked day after day. Some days we trekked 10 hours a day, even getting to our guest houses where we would stay after dark. And they would literally pull us up the side of the mountain across these great big swinging bridges that would go across rivers. We couldn't believe it. They fixed our meals. They fed us. They boiled our water. Everything we needed. And finally, the day came when we arrived at Annapurna Base Camp. The morning when we woke up the next day, everything was covered with ice and snow. And we thought, well, today's the day we use our evacuation insurance. But we talked to home, our leader, and he said, oh no, we're going to hike up to the memorial for all the people who have died on Annapurna. And then we'll come back and eat breakfast, and then we'll begin our hike down the mountain. So we had no choice. We put on everything we had. We got our poles. We didn't have all the heavy ice equipment, but we got the best we could do. And we went up to the memorial, we ate, and then we started our way back down the mountain in the ice and snow. And we fell a lot. Our porter would chop up the ice and snow in front of our path to try to keep it rough. Nobody got hurt. It was a complete miracle. Finally, we got back down to the place where we were going to catch the bus, the jeeps to go back to a hotel in Pokhara. All of us were so grateful for the experience. It had been a life-changing experience. We met the kindest, gentlest people in Nepal we had ever met. They had nothing, and yet they had everything in their heart. So we talked to our leader and we said, could we have a a dinner our last night with them and honor the porters and all they did for us, because they had never been able to eat with us. They would be back in the kitchen cooking, serving, boiling water, doing all the things, and they would never have time to eat with us. They would eat after we had gone to bed. And so he said, yes, he could agree to that. He thought a nice dinner like that with the porters would be wonderful. And now I always, when I travel, try to learn a story from that country, just in case there's an opportunity to tell that story along the way. And so I told Ham, our leader, I said, I have a story that I would like to tell at our farewell dinner, but I'd like to tell it to you and make sure it's appropriate. And so as we walked down to the Jeeps that last day, I told Ham the story of the tiger who thought he was a goat. He said it was perfect. He said, I don't know if you know, but in Nepal, we have a caste system. And all of our porters are from the poorest families, the poorest caste. They don't have opportunities to go to take educations and do things. They just are a strong, healthy young men. And this is a perfect story for them. And so finally, we got on the Jeeps down through these bumpy, rocky roads into the town of Pokhara and took the first shower we had had in 9 days, because the guest houses weren't heated, didn't have showers, and the only bathrooms were holes in the ground. So it was great to be in a real hotel. We cleaned up, got dressed, went down to the edge of the lake to a place where he had set up our farewell dinner. And we all ate, and it was a wonderful, wonderful evening. And then he looked over at me and smiled, and I got up. And he called the porters to stand right in front of me. And then all the rest of the hikers in our group stood behind the porters, and I began the story of the tiger. In the Chetan National Park in Nepal, there was once a mother tiger who was about to have a baby tiger. And she was wandering around through the Chetan forest, and all of a sudden she gave birth to this child. But a problem occurred and she died, but the tiger survived. And he was strong and healthy, and he began to move around. And the next day, it just so happened that a herd of goats came through that remote area in the Chetan Park. And this mother goat looked over at this little tiger, and she felt in her heart that she needed to do something for him. And so she went over and she began to feed him and care for him and take care of him. And so when the goats wandered on off to another location, the tiger went and stayed with the mother, and he became a strong, healthy tiger. Well, years passed and they wandered all around Nepal. And then one day they came back to the area where that baby tiger had been born. But by now he was a strong, healthy tiger. Well, while they were grazing in the area, an old tiger looked down and he saw that tiger with the goats. And he thought, how can that be? He couldn't have even heard the tiger making sounds like a goat. And finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. And he made his way down to the goats. And of course, all the goats scattered, but for some reason, that tiger did not. And so he wandered over to him and he said, what are you doing with these goats? And the young tiger said, they're my people. It's my mother. She raised me. They're all I've ever had. And the old tiger said, follow me. And they went down, down, down to a lake and wandered out for a drink of water. And while the young tiger was in the water, he saw for the first time his reflection. And he saw that he did not look like the goats. He looked like the old tiger. He couldn't believe it. He said, how did this happen? What's going on here? And the old tiger said to him, now that you know who you are, let the whole world hear you roar. And the life of that young tiger was changed forever. When I finished telling that story, every porter in our group had tears in their eyes. And I began to cry too. It was the most emotional time I've ever told stories. And I looked at all of them right into their eyes and I said, find your beauty and your truth and your strength and let the whole world hear you roar. And with that, we all were weeping. But finally, we got our act together and we started walking back to the hotel. And our leader home said, that was such a perfect story for those young men. You gave them hope that they would be able to find the person that they were meant to be. And that's the story of the tiger who thought he was a goat.
Thank you. Thank you. One more story to bring us home before we are ready to hear from all of you, your moments, stories of kindness. But Elisa, take us home.
Thank you, Diane. I love that story. It's so beautiful and inspiring. So I'd like to begin the story with one more quote from Aesop. No act of kindness is ever wasted, no matter how small. 1968 was the coldest winter and the snowiest winter that my 13-year-old self had ever experienced. You see, back in the fall, I had convinced my parents to get me a horse. And I was so excited. His name was Prince Jeffrey. He was a handsome quarter horse. I got to ride him a little bit in the fall, but the snow came early and all I could do that whole long winter was to lead him around the paddock and wait and watch. And it wasn't till the end of March that finally the snow had melted enough for us to go riding. Now, Wednesdays was half school day in our town, and my friend Wendy and I decided we would take the horses out and we would ride. Well, Prince Jeffrey was more excited than I was. He could barely constrain himself as we walked down the road till we came to Flint's Field. And as soon as those hooves touched earth, he just took off at a gallop. Whoa, I said, and I tried to rein him in, but he just reared up and bucked and reared and bucked. And that's how I went across the entire field, rearing and bucking until at last we got to the road. And as we crossed the road, I said, Wendy, would you please go first? I can't really control Prince Jeffrey. He just wants to take off. And so her kind of old doty horse went first as we trotted along into the woods, up another path, up a hill. But Prince Jeffrey wanted none of it. And again, he just took off and whoa, I pulled him in and he reared again and he bucked. And this time I fell on the ground. But my riding teacher, who was also a good friend's mother, said, girls, you never let go of the reins if they buck you off. You show them who's the boss. So there I was with the end of the reins, and there was Prince Jeffrey wanting to get away, and he kicked me right in the chest and took off. Well, I had never had the breath knocked out of me before. I thought maybe I was dying, and poor Wendy thought I was dying too. And she tied up her horse and ran up the hill toward the nearest house to get help. And to make a long story short, my mother eventually came back with her and they hauled me to the car and took me to the hospital and quickly discovered that I had a ruptured liver and a punctured lung, not to mention the broken ribs. And I was quickly operated on, and the doctors said that it would take 8 days to know if my liver would grow back and I would live. When I finally woke up from the operation in my hospital bed, my parents were there right at the rail. And apparently I said to my mom, I hate Prince Jeffrey, but I still want to ride. Well, I spent the next month in the hospital, most of it in ICU with tubes coming out of every opening in my body, and some that I didn't even know I'd had, some new ones. And I had interventions, I had pain medicine, but what I didn't have was friends. I had no friends. They couldn't come to the ICU. I didn't have a phone. I felt really cut off and really lonely. And my mom told me that my friend's mother had finally located the horse, Prince Jeffrey, and they were keeping it in their barn until they could find a new home for it. That was the first time in my life that I felt depressed. And I realize now, looking back, that I was grieving the loss of what I hoped would be my best pal, a horse that I could ride and have fun with, and grieving the fact that that horse almost killed me. Well, finally, the doctor said I could go home, and the nurse sat me on the edge of the bed and she said, "Missy, you are to listen to me. There'll be no roughhousing, no running, no jumping, no nothing, or you'll end up right back here. Do you want that?" No, I did not want that. And so I went home. But on the way home, my mother told me there'd be no going back to school either. I was so sad. I really missed my friends. And there'd been this guy, John Basili, who I had made out with at the school dance right before the accident. I was feeling like he'd probably given up on me and found someone else. And I just wanted to see my friends. Well, a few days passed, and then it was Wednesday, half school day. My mom was over at the office helping my dad when the doorbell rang. I slowly went down the stairs and opened the door, and there were 5 of my girlfriends, and they said, "Hi, want to come down to the school? Some of the boys are down there." I said, "I do, but I can't walk that way. It's way too far." I said, "Oh." And one of them said, "We'll carry you. We'll give you a piggyback." And I said, "I don't think that will be good for me." Another one said, "I know. We'll make you a queen's chair." And she put her hand on her forearm and the other hand on one of the other girls' forearms. And she did the same, and they bent down. And I sat on the queen's chair, put my arms around their shoulders, and they stood up. And we went out the front door, down the steps and down the driveway and across the street and down the sidewalk. And all the other girls were circling around, chirping and laughing. And I felt like a queen. And every now and then they'd change who was manning the queen's chair. And it just felt so good. We got down to the school, and there were boys there. John Basili was there, and everyone wanted to see my scar. And oh boy, there was gossip. And I felt like I was back in the gang. It wasn't long before my mother pulled up in the car, ferociously angry, and grabbed me and took me back home. But I didn't care, for I was happy again. I knew I belonged. All because of some small acts of kindness by my friends. And that's the end of my story. But hopefully not the end of the stories that we will hear. We have, about, 23 minutes. And what we would love to do is invite anyone who would like to put their name in the chat and tell just a short moment. We want to give everyone who wants to a chance. So it's not telling a whole long story. It's just crystallizing that moment where you experienced kindness. And so if anyone would like to take the lead, let's see what we have in the chat. I guess, Lani, you can help. Faye has a short one. Great, Faye. So good to have you with us.
Faye, you may be on mute. Can you take yourself off mute and join us?
Yeah.
I'm also going to stop the recording. I think that that's the easiest way to handle